Well, it was just a little over 5 years ago now that Douglas UCC established a search and call committee whose purpose was to search for and interview potential candidates for the pastor's position here. And those 5 men and women who served on the search and call committee, they did a lot of work in preparation for those interviews. For example, before they interviewed me, they went online and they Googled my name. I know, pretty scary. And they discovered that salacious novel I wrote 10 years ago. But they also discovered some audio and video recordings of speeches and sermons that I had given at other places. And they listened to all of them. And when I sat down to be interviewed, they told me how impressed they were with those speeches and sermons, but that there was one that concerned them. And it was the one in which I said that rocks are alive. They thought that was really weird, and I guess it is really weird. What I was speaking of for that sermon was, it was Palm Sunday, and I was talking about the Palm Sunday story where Jesus is coming down a donkey from a mountain, and he's coming into Jerusalem, and there's great fanfare to greet him. People are shouting with joy, and they're greeting Jesus, and they're so loud that the Pharisees, the religious authorities of Jesus' day, they demand that Jesus quiet down the crowd because they're making too much noise. And Jesus says to the Pharisees, if they be silent, these stones will shout. Jesus is pointing to the mountains behind him. These stones will shout. The hills are alive. And I know that sounds weird. I know we've been taught there's animal, vegetable, and mineral. Most of us believe that people have souls and spirits. And I know a lot of us believe animals have souls and spirits. And there are quite a few people in this room who believe that trees and plants have souls and spirits. But rocks? Rocks are just inanimate objects that we kick around. But think about it. Who created rocks? Are the mountains and rocks, are they man-made? No. They're God-made. God made them. So like all of creation, they're infused with God's stuff, God's DNA, God's energy and light. It is why so many people for many centuries of various faith traditions actually pray and meditate with sacred stones and crystals that they either hold in their hands or wear around their neck, because they believe that those stones, those crystals, have God's healing energy and light. Now, our indigenous ancestors, they understood this very well. They believed that the very ground on which we are standing, that it is alive, and that the rocks and the mountains are sacred and holy. Sarah did such a wonderful job this morning. Thank you for those excellent words. And the Spirit was working between us, because this week I shared with you in our epistle, our weekly church newsletter, a quote which was from John Muir. And as Sarah said, see, John Muir, who, as Sarah said, was the founder of the Sierra Club. He was known as John of the Mountains. And the quote that I shared with you said this. John Muir said, "I would rather be in the mountains thinking about God than in a church thinking about mountains," which is what we're doing today. But John Muir said, going to the mountains is going home. And I also found a quote, which was by the writer Aldous Huxley, who said, "A walk in the mountains is equivalent to worshiping at church. So what Huxley and Muir and our indigenous ancestors understood was that God is to be found in the mountains. Now, some of you know that 2 years ago, I led a group of 20 people from Douglas UCC on a spiritual pilgrimage to New Mexico. And we got to visit a monastery, which is called Christ in the Desert Monastery. And it was in the middle of nowhere. It was really hard to get to. We had to go down this long and winding and scary road up a hill. But it was so worth it, because once we got there, we got to pray with the monks in this chapel. And in this chapel, there was no stained glass. It was all clear glass, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked these beautiful red rock formations. Those rocks, they were the focus of our worship. Those rocks were the focus of our praise and adoration. And let me tell you, we found God's presence in those rocks. It was real and it was palpable. So today we are celebrating God in the mountains. And as we heard in our words of integration and guidance this morning, mountains appear in the Bible quite a bit. We know that Noah and Elijah and Moses and Jesus, they all encountered God in the mountains. Now, if you've been with us the past few Sundays, we've been talking about how the ancient people believed that God's dwelling place was up in the sky, that God lived up in the heavens. So it would make sense that they understood then that a mountaintop would be the closest you could get to where God was. So we heard in our Old Testament reading this morning that Graham read for us about Moses climbing up to the mountaintop, and up there sees the light of God in the burning bush and hears the voice of God. And then we see the same thing in the New Testament reading. Jesus goes up to a mountain and again is transfigured in the light, and we hear the voice of God. So what does that mean for us? If you want to experience the light of God, if you want to hear God's voice, you've got to go mountain climbing. But am I talking literally or spiritually? Well, I've shared with you all before, the stories of the Bible, they were written symbolically and they were meant to be understood symbolically. So you don't have to go up to a literal mountaintop, but you are being called to climb the spiritual mountain. Mountains in the Bible are symbolic. And what they symbolize is a place of higher consciousness. A place of higher consciousness. Most of us are dwelling in a place of lower consciousness. You know, we have a lower self and a higher self. And many people, unfortunately, are dwelling in the lower self. They're living in fear and worry and separation and lack and limitation. Psalm 121 says, I will lift up my eyes to the mountains, from whence comes my help. That's what we are doing in prayer and meditation, in mindfulness and spiritual practices. We are closing our physical eyes, and we are lifting up the spiritual eye to a place of higher consciousness where we can see more clearly, get an expanded view, a greater view. So we're lifting up our eyes and our hearts and our minds from fear to love. We're lifting up the sense of lack and limitation, and we're lifting it up to abundance. And we are lifting up separation, and we're lifting it up to experience oneness. That's why they encountered God's light and voice. They experienced the oneness. A place of higher consciousness. That's what we are doing in prayer. We are ascending the spiritual mountain. And up there we are getting God's view of situations. situations. We get to see things the way God sees them. And we get to see ourselves the way God sees us. Now, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King famously said, "I have been to the mountaintop." What mountain was he talking about? Which one did he go to? Wasn't a literal mountain. In that famous speech, he said, "God has allowed me to go up the mountain. I have been to the mountaintop. I have looked over, and I have seen the promised land." Where did he go? What did he see? Promised land. A land of peace, love, joy, prosperity, equality, freedom for all people. During a time in our country, during the civil rights struggle where many people were still living at a place of lower consciousness, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was able to arise, ascend to a place of higher spiritual consciousness where he could envision a world the way God visions it. And he was able to do that because of his faith, because of his spiritual practice. So that is what I am inviting you all to do this week that we're celebrating the mountains. I want you to find time this week to go mountain climbing. Now, you can literally do that if you want. We're lucky here. We have Mount Bald Head in Saugatuck. 300 steps. And you can climb those 300 steps and you get an amazing view of our beautiful, beautiful community. But you might not want to do that. You might just want to sit in the comfort of your own home and go spiritual mountain climbing. Again, close your eyes, get still, and ascend, arise. Lift up your eyes, lift up your hearts, lift up your minds, so that you can have an expanded vision, a greater view, a higher perspective, so that you can experience God's light and hear God's voice. I'd like to conclude with the words of the prophet Isaiah from chapter 2, verse 3. "Let us go up to the mountain where God will teach us to walk in God's path. Come, let us go up to the mountain of God." Namaste.